All right. Okay. All righty. Thank you, Eric, and thank you all who have tuned in. Tonight we're going to look at the writings of Edgar Allan Poe and the strange persona of Edgar Allan Poe. And as kind of a mirror of the times, and as kind of a mirror of his own psyche, and perhaps of our own as well, and for a certain take on style and on myth, which is uniquely his. And hopefully, we'll find ways into his writings to be able to kind of find meanings for ourselves, even today. So, well, I have to say of Edgar Allan Poe, of his forebearers, his mother was an actor. His mother was an actor, Eliza Poe. She came from England originally as a child. Well, yeah, as an 8 or 9 year old, sailing to America from London with her mother, also an actor, and then they arrived on our shores, and the life of an actor at that time was most more Shakespearean than, as I put it, more Shakespearean than it would be. The expectations were so different. The life of an actor was a working performing artist who traveled from town to town, bringing culture to various places in America, according to American tastes, according to what was available in America at the time in terms of literature and 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 other forms of art, which helped to determine the taste of the small towns and the live people before whom they would play, the players. And Eliza Poe and her mother were part of an acting troupe after they arrived in America, and it was called the Charleston Comedians, I think it was, the Charleston Comedians, and they toured throughout the South and through the Mid-Atlantic states also. And it is said that Eliza Poe, Edgar Allan Poe's mother, performed 300 roles in different acting, in dancing, and singing, and all of this, 300 roles, and a great deal of Shakespearean material as well. And it is said that she did play Ophelia and also Juliet Capulet. And so this is deeply in his forebearing. But now also there were she married Eliza Poe. Her mother passed away some 5 years or so after they came to America, and so Eliza Poe, yeah, she was acting on stage from the age of about 9 or so, or 10, and this is what she was doing. And then her mother passed away, and they were managed by Mr. Edgar. He was the manager of the place and or of the troupe, and she was married to him. Hi. So feel free, yes, to enjoy the place. And so I'm talking about Edgar Allan Poe's mother, and who was an actor in up and down the Mid-Atlantic and in the South. And well, anyway, so she married David Poe Jr. And David Poe was he doesn't have a good reputation in history now. Over and over again, the biographies describe him as a bad-tempered alcoholic, one who deserted the family, actually. A son was born a couple of years before Edgar Allan, and then Edgar Allan was born in 1809 in Boston, they were. And then some 2 or 3 years later, a daughter, Rosalie, was born. But by this time, David Poe had left the family, and it is said that he was an actor, too, for a while, but he did not have the stage experience that was already there with the other actors around him, so it didn't fare so well with those in the audience who left some record of having seen David Poe Jr., that is. I have to say that David Poe Jr., his father was David Poe Sr., who came from Ireland, and in about 1750, and was an active participant in the American Revolution, a quartermaster, and he supplied a great deal of goods to the revolutionary soldiers out of his own pocket, so much so that Marquis de Lafayette awarded him a generalship. And so he enters history in that way. Now, he was their son, David Jr. I think that they wanted him to be a lawyer, but he wanted to be an actor. And so off he went to the big cities and the small cities as well. And he got married to Eliza Poe, and they had 3 children, and then he left. And it is not really known for sure what happened to him, except it is said, and it is always in the sources, in the books, this is what they say, that he died just a few months after Eliza did. And both of them died of the same cause, tuberculosis, consumption, as it was called then. And how old was Edgar Allan Poe at this time? He was, I think he was 2 when his mother passed away after his father left. And this was something that was more, this was part of the literary style back then of people passing away, and this is very much a part of daily life in America at this time. And well, anyway, so they were farmed off to various relatives. The older brother went to live with his grandparents, with David Sr. Edgar went to live in a family, the Allans, actually. That's where his middle name comes from, actually. Edgar Allan Poe. He was never formally adopted, but the Allan family took him in, and they were well-established merchants in Richmond. And at certain times, actually, they were even a little bit more rich. And Rosalie was adopted by a family also of some means, also in Richmond. And so, and they did keep in contact with each other to some degree over the years, But nevertheless, this is, and we associate this with Edgar's persona. His life is early marked by tragedy, and this begins to. You begin to see this more and more as a theme in his life, and as well as a theme in his writings, and but also a lot of other things. And so for a while, when Edgar was 6 or so, the family sailed to England, and for some 5 years, or maybe Edgar was a little bit older, but he was schooled. A lot of his early schooling was over in England. And they also visited some relatives of the Allan family up in Scotland. So he spent time there, and that's where he got a lot of his formative education from in his childhood and in his adolescence. And then they came back to Richmond, and then there were certain financial setbacks and things, the Panic of 1837, such like, and then they were back in Richmond. And then Edgar was, his adopted father, Mr. Allan, was, it is said, of a dour disposition, and it seemed like Edgar, as time went on, was more and more of a wayward youth in ways that would not be unfamiliar to us now, excelling in some of his studies, and yet not, adhering to any strict regimen of discipline, and subject to willful acts, and so there was some alienation then, but he was always on good terms with his foster mother, and he had some friends in his adolescence, and there was the mother of one who was kind of a confidant of his. So now we're talking about Edgar, young Edgar in his formation, and he's finding, I think it was clearly, kind of a mentor figure, a teacher figure, a certain kind of mentor in this mother of one of his friends. And it was outside the home, and it seems to me that there was a kind of a bond of like kindred spirits, a kind of a bond that he would form kind of outside the confines of the family, which already he would be sort of alienated from that, having lost his mother at such an early age and everything. And so that's also something to consider when we think about Edgar's view of human character, as we would come to understand it in the various ways that he expressed it later on. And then there was his schooling. He was early on an assiduous assimilator of the classics of literature at that time, the English classics. Your Keats and, of course, Alexander Pope and Lord Byron, both as a poet and as kind of like a heroic figure, was an inspiration to Edgar at that time. What with the fame and the dashingness and also the scandal and all of this, as well as the great facility with literature, which in strange ways reflected the life in a fascinating and enigmatic way, making Lord Byron a public figure and imbuing Edgar with this notion of being a poet himself, and in the mold or after the fashion of Lord Byron, so that his early poems, or have the Byronic themes. He even has an early poem called Tamerlane, and a poem called El Araf, which seemingly on the surface of it looks like a classical kind of like, romantic, exotic, Middle Eastern kind of poem, and it is. And it's also got the adolescent kind of irregular kind of surges of feeling, but at the same time, it's dense with all kinds of forgotten lore, you might say. Already he's reflecting his own times in the sense of kind of an illuminist take on things. And this is out there in the culture of America at this time also. This the spiritual side of things, the psychic side of things, the romantic, the intuitive, the imaginative, the mythical side of things reflected in some of the popular culture. Reflected, it would have to be on the stage, and along with that, the Shakespearean sense. Everything in Shakespeare then becomes available, to everything that Shakespeare studies and alludes to somehow becomes energized through the imagination of Shakespeare, appearing on the stage in places like America and being picked up on in stylistic imitators in the literary magazines. And so all that Elizabethan hocus pocus, and all the allusions to the ancient Roman and Greco-mythological themes, which have their own kind of like magical tradition. You have Virgil, the author of the Aeneid, but you also have in the Middle Ages Virgil the enchanter, Virgil the mage. So there is a great many open doorways for some of these figures of diabolical and illuminated psychic sorcery to flit in and out as characters in his imagination and as role models for him to model himself after in a certain sense. And so already, the man of masks, it's all of that is there, and it's very much in the style of the times. Yeah, you have to say that also because we don't look at Edgar Allan Poe in the same way that we look at, say, Walt Whitman as like an outrider or like some noble manifestation of his own, whereas Edgar comes out of the popular story tradition, the popular magazine tradition, actually. So I mentioned that he's a poet and he's styling himself as a poet, and he's finding people to subsidize small editions of some of these adolescent poems, which also, though, are still read as part of his major work. That's another thing about him, kind of an enfant terrible, kind of a prodigy, because some of the works that he wrote in his teens are still considered part of what characterized all the more famous works of Poe that we see today. But be that as it may, he's also aware of the difficulty of making a living by means of poetry alone. And he's aware of the reading public and its taste being dominated by English authors, and the so many of the English authors from across the Atlantic have such a hold upon like the reading public that his political consciousness actually. One thing that you can say about it, he takes it very, very personally about the lack of just copyright law, you see. And so this too makes it hard to make one's living by poetry. But at the same time, there's all these magazines that are coming up in all these different towns, in Baltimore, Boston, and New York, and Richmond, of course. And so he begins to realize that if he's going to he's got to write for the magazines, and to write for the magazines, you've got to write in a form. After people like Dickens and others, you got to write in the form of where you publish serial stories that will keep a popular reading public attentive. And so then you get, literarily speaking, then you begin to realize, there are these external demands that one must follow, but at the same time, one can answer those demands in kind of a creative and stylistic way in the form of the artwork. Just very much like an actor has to, hold the attention of the audience to make a recognizable form that will entertain people to some degree, and yet that too can become a demand that can be met creatively in the development of the art form, so that as well as appealing to the popular audiences, one can contribute more somehow. Through creative art, one can contribute more to the imagination of the nation, of the soul of the nation and of the people as it develops and as it goes along. So Poe, of course, is an artist, is what I'm saying, and yet he's living as an artist in a popular context with certain really strict and demanding kind of challenges, and so there's that. But he's got the dose of that. He's racked with the dazzling blaze of his own adolescent greatness, and his friend's mother passes away. I don't know if it was of consumption or not. So the energy of the grief kind of becomes part of his persona, and he swims as a stunt, as a test to prove something, a vitality in himself, much like Lord Byron swam the Hellespont. Edgar Allan Poe, as a teenager, I think 18 or something like this, he swam 6 miles in the James River against the tide on a hot and sunny day, and I think it got some attention in the papers. And so this is something that is also this impetuous quality, this acting out kind of quality. And yes, because of being from a family of some means, then it becomes, the next step is for him to enter the University of Richmond, Thomas Jefferson's university. The University of Virginia at Richmond, Thomas Jefferson's university. And Thomas Jefferson was still alive a little while Poe was there. And I'm not sure. I believe, I could be off in this. I think it was James Madison who actually gave Poe a Latin examination, and maybe, I don't know, Thomas Jefferson was still around. It was his vision that got that university founded, and Edgar Allan Poe was there. But these are Napoleonic gentlemen, quote unquote, young and impetuous, and Southern and all of this. And so it was a culture of there was some dueling that went on, and there was gambling, and you see, and Edgar blamed his foster father for not providing him with enough funds for basic things like blankets and books. And so Edgar seems to have taken to gambling and accrued some gambling debts that were causing some big, financial challenges to enable him to stay there. And eventually he had to leave. He had to leave before graduating. I think he spent only a couple of years there, but he excelled in things like mathematics and in things like French and Latin, and he was writing verse, entertaining his classmates, and also publishing. I think it was then that he published Al-Araf while he was a student at the university. I'm not sure, but then there was a falling out with his father, and so he impetuously joined the military. Yes, Edgar Allan Poe served a couple of years in the military. He sailed to Boston, I think, and then joined there, and then they sailed down to Fort Moultrie in South Carolina, and then he served at another place, but after a little while he wanted to get out, and he was able to use some influence, and he re-established his relationship with his foster father, which is something that he would do, and you see this also, that Edgar is, he's living in a kind of a dramatic kind of hand-to-mouth way, and he's using his expressive talents for pragmatic purposes sometimes in terms of his dealings with people, and oh yes, and along about this time, he begins to, well, who knows when it started, but more and more people began to talk about a lack of temperance in the young man, and this led to a certain kind of, at times, reputation among some of unreliability, so to speak, and so much so. An early romance, Sarah Elmira Royster, I think was her name, Sarah Elmira Royster, and then when he was a teenager, and to the extent that they were to some degree engaged, or they were talking about engagement, but her father broke it off, said no, because this one here, is not reliable, you know. This was before he joined the military, and then he was in the military, and then he was able to get out of the military. I think they found a substitute. This was a thing that could happen at that time. This would be 1820 something, yeah, and 1820s. You could find and pay a substitute to take your place in the military if you had the right kind of connections and things. And Edgar was able to swing this, or Edgar's father was able to swing this, and so he got out of the military. Oh, he was promoted to sergeant major, which actually piqued his interest a little bit longer, but eventually he still wanted to get out. And where did he go from there? To West Point. Yes, Edgar Allan Poe was in West Point for a couple of years. And yes, he was a very good student. He wrote some of the poems that I might explore a little bit later. And but he began to not show up for muster, and this is, of course, a very disciplined life, and it wasn't possible for him to maintain that level of discipline required, or that kind of discipline required at that time. So after a couple of years, he left West Point, and I think that at some point after West Point, his estrangement with his foster father was final, and so after that, he was living on his own. There were relatives on his both his birth mother and birth father's side that he could stay with in Baltimore and in Richmond, and sometimes he would share his income with them. What income that he was now beginning to make from prize money in magazines. There were literary contests, and Edgar, that's where he wrote for them at times, and he wrote potboiler type things. But yeah, we talk about potboilers. And you might think of Mickey Spillane or something like this. But when Edgar Allan Poe is writing potboilers, for that kind of audience, for that kind of effect, he's writing stuff like Fall of the House of Usher, in Ligia, and the Pit and the Pendulum, and the Cask of Amontillado, and the Telltale Heart. And yeah, these are potboilers, but what is it about them? The way that Edgar Allan Poe, what he brings to them, that's when you begin. Well, it's clear for all of us. That's why we know of him now. You see, these are masterpieces. These are totally unique, and yet they do reflect the taste of the time. And they're eminently readable, but there's something more about them. That they're creepy subject matter, but something about them is also creepy. And you could just enumerate all these things. I don't know if I can do it justice exactly. I would like to follow kind of a slightly different trajectory, though, about this. Let's go back into how he was living at the time, at these times now, as he's entering into his early adulthood and beginning to become Edgar Allan Poe, the writer. And he lived with his aunt on his father's side. Her name was Clem, though, and his aunt had a daughter, Virginia Clem. And when Poe lived with them, first in Richmond and then in Baltimore, when he went to Baltimore for writing reasons, magazine reasons, work reasons, he fell into just a pit of despondency being without them. And so he was able to send for them and arrange for them and support them. And he was able to, that was his household, and he was very much attached to it because it was, it was his aunt, and it was also his young cousin. And so this is also a part of Edgar Allan Poe's reputation, that is something it's a fact, that his relationship with his cousin was very, very close. And though he was 10 to 12 years older than her, I think he was 27 and they were publicly married, and I think she was 13, and also his first cousin. And so this is part of, this is always well known, and this is part of Edgar Allan Poe's myth: a troubled individual, a creepy individual, but yet at the same time, it was not unknown at that time, for whatever you say about it, and he was devoted to them, and even though he would have these well-known public kind of platonic romances with other women in the literary and publicity kind of world, he was very much devoted to Virginia Clem, so much so that the family curse asserted itself or came forth when Virginia Clem, well, she was 20, in her mid-20s by this time. They were married for a good 10 or 12 years. She passed away in 1847, I believe. And then in the late 1830s, she was playing piano at home, the parlor music, and the pulmonary hemorrhage occurred, and she was direly ill for a while, but then she got better. But then this was going to be a kind of inevitable process, as it was known, and so in his sorrow, Edgar threw himself into his work at times and drank heavily at other times, and it is known, and he writes about it in a very forthright manner. His letters are also another aspect of his expressive personality, where you get more of a straight up image of an individual who would address you in this way, sometimes in a state of dire need, and yet subject to extremes of temperament and personality. So he would write about being able to stay up for days and write, and in a fever of work, and then at other times not being able to lift his head up from the pillow. So there's this kind of going on, and so he's under these kind of circumstances. Well, so at that point, I would like to think about what is in his artistic mind, which we can look at now, and then we can go back into some of the other things. So I would like to just throw out some of his quotations. Here's the Shakespearean side of it, when Shakespeare tells us, we are such stuff as dreams are made on. Edgar writes, all that we see is but a dream within a dream. Those who dream by day are cognizant of many things which escape those who dream only by night. So we call Edgar Allan Poe a romantic for many reasons, but you see here, you begin to get a taste of a kind of like a romantic, intuitive kind of character who is not afraid to say an extreme statement, I became insane, he says in a letter, with long intervals of horrible sanity. I became insane with long intervals of horrible sanity. This is, a dramatic picture of an actual mind working within its material, you see. I was never really insane, he writes in another letter. I was to his aunt, the mother of his bride. I was never really insane except upon occasions when my heart was touched. So we have the dream, we have sanity and insanity, we have the heart, and the heart being touched. But let us also, I wish I could write as mysterious as a cat. He said, I think a fictional figure said that. Invisible things are the only realities. You see, sometimes I imagine Edgar Allan Poe as a sage speaking to me like a voice in the night. I might say, Edgar Allan Poe, your consciousness as an artist produces these things, these designs, these styles, these arabesques, these grotesques, these tales of ratiocination, as he called them. Those were his detective tales of ratiocination, where you get inside the characters and you reason with them as they go in and out of these situations. And then you realize some of his characters are not all there, so to speak, the unreliable narrator. And so you go into all that. So the tales of ratiocination, but there's something else. The artificer, and the critic. Yes, this, as disordered as we want to think of Poe as in his life and in some of the extremities of his dramatic portrayals and the well-designed and creepy craftiness of some of these effects of horror, we've got to understand also that he was very generous in his writings as a critic, and very influential. As I've mentioned, he is coming out of a tradition where the materials of your art are determined by harsh and restrictive external demands, the demands of the reader, the demands of the audience, but also the demands of the form itself, of the page, of the ink, of the pen, of the cognizing reading mind. And so he begins to formulate his critical principles kind of out of this kind of context. When he and he's also reviewing other works of art. May I mention also, in his other works of art, this is the other side of Poe that's also important to realize. The put-down artist, or the harsh kind of critic, or they called him the tomahawk man. This was what they called him, because he was willing to be very aggressive in some of his reviews sometimes, for political reasons. And when I say that, I don't mean that he was a politician, quote unquote, in the political sense, but someone who is kind of championing some kind of promoting, I should say. When I say political, perhaps I mean promotional, a certain kind of literary persona, which has something to do with his own interest in a certain kind of way he wants the tide of fortune to go. And so this is a thing that is happening in any kind of literary criticism at any time. You can see this kind of like this kind of cutting quality, and then you wonder what interest is being served when another work of art is being kind of looked at. You have to look at criticism with a critical eye. And even when you acknowledge that in Edgar Allan Poe, you still are able to come away with a great many abundant, eternal principles, which are still very much alive today in our quest for understanding of standards of aesthetic rectitude. So, in a review of Hawthorne, I don't remember which work of Hawthorne it was, but in a review of a work by Hawthorne, Nathaniel Hawthorne, he writes out the beginning of his principles of what constitutes an effective short story. Before the term short story was like a labeled literary genre, he would call it the prose tale. And there are those who say that Edgar Allan Poe, as a critic of the novelist's art, is not as strong because he did not write in that form. But he did, of course, in the narrative novel of the Journey of Arthur Gordon Pym, which wasn't completed. And Edgar Allan Poe later on referred to it as a silly book. But it's a novel for sure, and it's really quite good, of course. But that's the longest thing he ever wrote, though he wrote a lot of long short stories. Anyway, in this review of Hawthorne, he spoke of unity of effect. Unity of effect is a thing to be desired in a prose tale. He's writing for his tastes are shaped by this, and the taste that he is shaping is shaped by this. It needs to be read in a single setting. Talk about a pragmatic standard. It must be read in a single setting, maybe taking a couple of hours or something like that. He's talking about a somewhat different attention span than he would be today, I would think. But, there's still that kind of tension, though. That still is there in the American character, the tiny minuteness, of the public and what it pays attention to, and the way that it is easily tricked and beguiled and hooked into things that it shouldn't necessarily be hooked into, which is, of course, for Poe, the artist, that becomes his stock in trade. The tale of effect, and he would write about this. Some works are made for their effect, and he's a working performer, you might say. So he's a kind of a magician, a stage magician in his writing, in a certain sense, to jump to a more kind of theatrical presentation of Poe as a critical artist. But still, that is very much there in some of the things that he writes. Can I jump into something else then about that? What was it about that I wanted to say? Um, well, as so often happens, I don't quite remember what it was. The Tales of Ratiocination, was it? Or was it something else? Was it about the hoax? Yes, maybe it was about the hoax. The most notorious thing he did in a certain sense. He engaged in oh, this long-standing accusation of plagiarism against Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, actually accusing him of plagiarism, but I think it was pretty vague grounds. What, after all this plagiarism? I mean, Poe himself, as every artist, a tailor, a filcher, a thief of thoughts, an adapter, very much so, especially, working in the popular trades, as Poe was. Whereas Longfellow was more established as a literary figure. He went to Harvard and all this stuff. Oh yeah, that's another thing about Edgar Allan Poe. He is a working man of letters, working out a bohemian, working in circumstances of poverty and his own extremes of character and behavior. And compared to these Boston Brahmins, compared to the English on the other side, he is an he is an autodidact. If you really want to be an autodidact, you will say he is a autodidact. Ha ha ha. In order to not be grammatical, But but this is also such a unique perspective. This is one of the homegrown genius qualities about him. He's as original as Johnny Appleseed in that sense, and yet he's writing about Gothic, dark, romantic themes. And yet, of course, at the same time, he's a West Point dropout. So you have all this kind of stuff about him that is so memorable as a literary personality. Anyway, so I want to say to you that even though it would seem that Edgar Allan Poe is primarily interested in working in the area of the prose tale meant for popular readership, he's very much still involved in his soul with poetry. And at times it might take a back seat to all the things that he is doing. But at the same time, it still is working away, and a very distinct style and utterance and statement is being developed. And so, like, for example, thematically, we have the creepier things that he might say, creepier critical principles. It's always quoted about him. He said this, but remember, he's a hyperbolist. And yeah, sometimes a bad boy, shocking and offending, and creeping out. And yet you must understand the very circumstances of his life are so theatrical that it's like his legend is just given to us. And the soulful individual behind that legend, we must not judge too harshly. But anyway, so among the things that he said that people always remember is the most beautiful, the most appropriate poetic topic is the death of a beautiful woman. And this sounds like, what? How could it be understood? But then when you understand that these are flowery, extreme kind of statements, these are sentimental and Gothic kind of a style of expressing oneself, but also the times are like this. There were many, many beautiful dead people that were dying all the time. And think about Edgar's mother, the actress. Think about Edgar as a toddler, at the bedside, and understand that this was not an uncommon experience at all. And yet, Edgar is an artist whose muse is going to take him, in some respects, you see, his muse takes him where it will. And so that's where we have to look at it in this way too, in his poetry. What I'm kind of like, I have to chew on this bone for a while, and that's the morbidity of Edgar Allan Poe's thematic subject matter sometimes. And it's like, what, is he actually talking about with all the sepulchres and the mausoleums and the funereal imagery and the beloved who is mourned for incessantly, who is so beautiful and who suffered such an evil fate in so many ways, and yet whose will is so strong, like in Ligeia, if I'm pronouncing it right. That was one of his classic horror tales, Christopher Lee, Frank Hamer, they made some of those great movies. But where the beautiful woman dies, but her will is so gigantic that it occupies it possesses the soul of the bereaved husband's future lover, and this kind of thing. And it's like, okay, but the morbidity of it. And at the same time, though, I think Poe's verse is so metrically complex and intricate, and greatly so. That's so much a part of it. But it's always describing these, or not always, not at all always, but it has this reputation. It's so funereal and exquisitely morbid and perfectly chiseled and fine. But we also have to say that, man, when you're hung up in mourning, what is the most structured thing? It would be a corpse. Didn't Audubon, the great bird artist, he needed to have the bird still so that he could compose. He needed to have the stillness of death. The bird had to die before Audubon could compose a picture of it to get the anatomy right. The movement was not a part of it. A living form that you see, but movement is not a part of it. Well, for Edgar Allan Poe, that could be the case in many of his poems, and the movement is taken out and put into these intricate kind of moves, this intricate verse. And so it's, you got to understand it as the working out of a complex. That's one of the ways you can understand it. But then you can go from there too, because, well, first of all, I want to urge us to be aware of that. That's not all that there is to Poe. I've mentioned Poe the sage. He becomes a sage when we begin to attend to his voice in its individual thoughts. And then you realize such a troubled soul who achieved such legendary success in this certain way, which sort of like would seem to warp his gift almost, well, yes, in some, but it's so rich and so many-sided that then you begin to see, well, no, there's a more shadowy and more healthy. Yes, Poe's shadow is a healthy one. So it's like a reverse of what we usually get, and which is what makes him so fascinating, the solar side and the lunar side. Well, anyway, I have to tell you this. Okay, so I want to explore some of his actual writings just a little bit. I've mentioned the morbidity, and we'll have something to do with that. But I also want to mention something else about it. Oh, yes. Okay, let's begin to see. One of his words I think that is neglected. Well, not neglected, I don't know what that might mean. For me, I am interested, and more so as time goes on, whenever Poe whenever Poe addresses psyche, whenever Poe mentions or addresses psyche in a poem, I begin to see, psyche. She is the prototype of the human being who is an external image of the God, to such a degree that their human life is affected by this, and they become troubled in a way, and then they suffer exile and are cast away, and then come under the spell of the actual God and endure the trials of those things, and then Psyche comes back to life after having journeyed through such an experience. You see, Psyche was in Greco-Roman times, a legendary young woman whose beauty was so great that when people saw her, they thought that they were seeing an incarnation of Aphrodite herself. And they began to hail her in this way, and she was young and just, what are they talking about? She could see right away that they were looking at what she represented to them. So she was detached from their adulation in a canny and wise way, but at the same time, it was such an influence on her life and the external circumstances of her life. And then I cannot go into the entire myth, but a prophecy is made about her future husband is actually a monster, and she is cast away, and she ends up taken by the west wind into a beautiful castle with beautiful signs and images on the walls. It is the castle of her husband, who does come, but only at nighttime, and she never sees him. him. He is invisible to her, and she falls in love with him and is carrying his child, as they say, and never sees him. And at some point she decides, under the influence of her sisters, whom she does manage to see, she begins to want to see him in with her eyes. And so a candle, some kind of illuminating vessel, she holds it over him as he sleeps, and she spills some of the wax, the hot wax on him, and he wakes up and he flies out the window and lands in a cypress tree and curses her and flies away, and she never expects to see him again, but she must see him again. He is her beloved, and so she goes searching for him everywhere in the hope of finding him somewhere. And she undergoes a great many trials, and she goes to the underworld. She eventually becomes captive of Aphrodite herself, who is so jealous and envious, and Aphrodite treats her harshly, as gods can in this version of the divine imagination. And but she endures, she overcomes, she is helped, she is loved, she comes forth and becomes a god herself, and yet is also a human. It's a gorgeous myth and very, very rich. And for every morbid thing in Edgar Allan Poe, anytime he mentions Psyche, you know his gift is moving there also. So this poem is called To Helen. Now, I don't remember the name of his friend, the mother of one of his chums in his late adolescence. But this poem is written, though it's written to Helen, the classical figure, it's known that he has her in mind. And you will hear the classical kind of stuff. But I wonder if we can touch something more here. Well, let's find out. Helen, thy beauty is to me like those Nicean barks of yore, that gently over a perfumed sea the weary, wayward wanderer bore to his own native shore. On desperate seas long wont to roam, thy hyacinth hair, thy classic face, thy naiad airs have brought me home to the glory that was Greece and the grandeur that was Rome. Lo, in you, brilliant window niche, how statue-like I see thee stand, the agate lamp within thy hand. Ah, Psyche, from the regions which are holy land. Now, we see her like she's a statue. That's the Poe that we're familiar with. A statue, of course, a statue made of cold marble, perfect and yet somehow soulless. I mean, people get that feeling from Poe sometimes, but there's something else in this poem, because when he's looking at the statue, he sees her as a statue. He's seeing Psyche, but the reference to the myth is there. She is holding a candle in her hand, or some kind of lantern, and Psyche from the regions. See, he sees her standing statue-like. What's his word? The agate lamp within thy hand. The agate lamp within thy hand. The agate, is the stone that is so rough on the outside. You break it open and it's beautiful on the inside, and it's hard and smooth. It is not marble. It is not alabaster. The agate lamp with. I wonder if they used that as the tiniest layers of that, like mica. I wonder if they used it as like a shade on an ancient lantern, as a glass to protect the light inside. I don't know. That could be a Poe kind of thing. But she's holding it in her hand, and we know what happens with that lantern. It moves. It spills, which is not supposed to happen in a controlled statue world. It lands on living flesh. It lands on the son of Aphrodite himself, upon Eros. It burns him. It wakes him up. He flies away. He stands in a cypress tree, Venus's tree, and the rest is history. But she's holding that, and so it's like a statue, but it isn't really a statue, because it's holding this illumination. It's holding this thing that's going to bring the story into another dimension, and he just sees it in that perfect one moment. And of course, Psyche from the regions which are holy land. From the regions. When you have from, you have to. Psyche is the journeying soul itself for him. And so we know he's writing it to a former mentor, a mentor of his, an elder sister, a guide who awakened in him something, or who nourished in him something that was already awake from an early age, albeit in a warped way. Anyway, so there's Psyche, and there is this. Here's another of his poems. This is himself. So we see Edgar in this poem. We see Psyche, and now here is Edgar himself. He wrote this one from a young age also. Alone, from childhood's hour, I have not been as others were. I have not seen as others saw. I could not bring my passions from a common spring. From the same source I have not taken my sorrow. I could not awaken my heart to joy at the same tone, and all I loved alone. Then, in my childhood, in the dawn of a most stormy life, was drawn from every depth of good and ill the mystery which binds me still, from the torrent or the fountain, from the red cliff of the mountain, from the sun that round me rolled in its autumn tint of gold, from the lightning in the sky as it passed me flying by, from the thunder and the storm, and the cloud that took the form, when the rest of heaven was blue, of a demon in my view. A cloud that took the form, when the rest of heaven was blue, of a demon in my view. You see, a cloud that took the form of a demon. The cloud took the form of a demon. Ooh, the demon did not take the form of the cloud. So that's a little bit less of a potboiler kind of image when you realize it's a cloud that takes the form of the demon. Now, Edgar in a story would want to make that demon real. But Edgar in this poem about himself as a character with the imagination to make the things that will be other versions of Edgar, in this poem, Edgar realizes it's the cloud, the illusion, is what takes this form. You see, so always, this is the nature of his being. It's the language is like an axis. It's an axial kind of language, and like a living vine, it coils around. And what is true one moment is false in another moment. And what is genuine in one moment is artificial in another moment. But it's always going to reflect, in a real sense, the actual interplay of these actual comprehensive divine realities. And so let's not get too caught up in seeing this kind of like this morbid, pasty, Vincent Price kind of diabolical artificer, which Poe is too, of course, but there's also this. Here's a sonnet called To Science. Now, this, let us not forget, I'm going to cast my mind forward a little bit to one of Poe's, a great work of Poe's, the work that he called he thought of as his greatest work. The last work he composed, I think pretty much maybe for some little articles or things, it is the long prose piece called Eureka. But it is not fiction. It is. Is it philosophy? Is it speculative? Is it natural philosophy? He certainly uses 19th century terms of science. But it's all over the place. It's Eureka. It's his solution to the cosmic mysteries. And there are those even now who say it's unreadable. He was mad when he wrote it, and I'm not so sure about that. We'll explore it a little bit. I hope to. I hope we can get to that. But Eureka fully fulfills what I'm starting to say, actually, about the psyche and the notion of a living and beating heart that expands and contracts. And though the writing is axial to the nth degree, now here, now there, is he putting you on yes and no? But it's also, there's a certain kind of consistency there when he's talking about the particular and the unified, and the all in the one, and the one in the all these many ways. And I have to say, Einstein liked this book. Einstein read Eureka twice, it is said. And I think he said something to the effect of, this is a valuable work of a very independent intellect, paraphrasing what Einstein said about Eureka. At the time, some of his contemporaries, severed their contact with him because of its seeming, heresy. Well, and a lot of other reasons, of course. Contacts with Edgar Allan Poe by his contemporaries and peers were made and remade and broken again and again, because it charged kind of political world. But anyway, so when he's talking about science in this poem, the sonnet is called To Science. He's going to be evoking, as if from the unknown, a certain style of language, but he's also going to call to account a certain kind of thing that has put a damper on the mythical spirit. But that's part of the give and take of life, of course. Anyway, this is the poem I would like to tell you. Science, true daughter, of old time thou art, who alterest all things with thy peering eyes. Why preyest thou thus upon the poet's heart, vulture, whose wings are dull realities? How should he love thee, or how deem thee wise, who wouldst not leave him in his wandering, to seek for treasure in the jeweled skies, albeit he soared with an undaunted wing? Hast thou not dragged Diana from her car, and driven the Hamadryad from the wood, to seek a shelter in some happier star? Hast thou not torn the Naiad from her flood, the elfin from the green grass, and from me, the summer dream, neath the tamarind tree? You see, they're so well made. You would love to have them become a part of your imagination so that you could feast on different lines in your mind. I mean, vulture whose wings are dull realities. And you know that he felt the dull reality as intensely as he felt the supercharged one. And these become the polarities of his art, as they would at any time. So now, there's more, though, we have to think about. Yes, I want to mention, sometimes it's for Poe, and with one whose reputation is like Poe, you can look at him through the eyes of some of these other authors and some of these other minds. And so that can help with the colloquy, the colloquium, the consortium, the symposium. So I want to mention Einstein has given us a glimpse. We've seen a little bit through Einstein's eyes of Poe, and the interest that Einstein paid with Einstein's consciousness to the consciousness of Poe. I want to mention also Walt Whitman had apt things to say about Poe, as did D.H. Lawrence in his Studies in Classical American Literature. I want to mention that. Oh, and I wanted to also to mention something that is that from Nietzsche, because he speaks of someone like Poe and of like Lord Byron in a certain sense. And I just want to put this out there too when I talk about like the pot boiler side of Poe. So Nietzsche says, these great poets, like Byron, Musset, and Poe, are and must be poets of the moment, sensual, absurd, fivefold, irresponsible, and sudden in mistrust and trust, with souls in which they must usually conceal some fracture, often taking revenge with their works for some inner contamination, often seeking with their high flights to escape into forgetfulness. From an all too faithful memory, idealists from the vicinity of swamps. So I want to just contrast when Poe speaks of Psyche from the Holy Land thou art from. Nietzsche, talking about Poe, says idealists from the vicinity of swamps. But idealist, eidolon, idealite. I mean, I don't know, from the vicinity of swamps, the troubles, the softness and the diffusion and the deep pit, the swamp of the unknown, the undigested, and all of this. So I don't know. What would we say though? Some of the things also that Poe, one moment it is not there, and then the next moment it is there. This uncanny kind of what element of the cosmos has come to us from Poe that is digested through the unique being of Edgar Allan Poe. It is there one moment, and it is not there the next. I want to limit it to just a few of the gods that I've mentioned: Psyche, Aphrodite, and the moon goddess Diana, Artemis. But then there's also who moves in such divine realities. There's also Poe himself taking part in his times. In 1849, gold was discovered in California, and the gold rush took place. And Poe's sense, just for a moment, can we just kind of look at Poe as like a cartographer of the psychic landscape of historical America? We can talk about the mid-Atlantic. We can talk about antebellum times. We can talk about copyright laws between England and in America and the effect that it had on the literary market. We can talk about the Panic of 1837 and all of this, and the Whigs and the Young America movement and some of these editors and James Russell Lowell. Anyway, we can talk about all that kind of stuff, but we can also look at Baltimore and Richmond and New York and Lowell, Massachusetts, actually, where he sort of would have these strange love affairs after Virginia passed away, and he spent some time in Lowell, Massachusetts, Kerouac country, and I don't know. But then there's the gold rush and westward expansion. He had something to say about that kind of stuff too, and he would satirize it in his prose work, Words from a Mummy. But anyway, the gold rush took place, and there was the rush for gold. And then all of a sudden, he wrote a story called The Gold Bug. I wanted to mention the cryptograms and the cryptographies. He was so expert at solving cryptographies. One of his publicity gambits as a magazine writer and sometimes a magazine editor, but it was difficult for him to hold on to those positions for very long, as I understand it, because of his hot and cold kind of like, work habits and stuff. But he offered to solve any cryptogram sent to him by the readers, and he solved them. And of course, the plots. Yeah, I mentioned the rhyme schemes and the intricacies of that. Well, in his Tales of Ratiocination, the plots, of course, are very intricately and designed so that, like Hitchcock, you might say Hitchcock is a similar kind of mind in this respect. The effect of all the different moving parts, all play their role in such a way that you cannot subtract one part and take that away without messing up the entirety of the whole. But he did not always write his tales like that. He wrote in the picaresque as well, and the mythical, and he knew very much about that. So it wasn't like he was championing one form or another. He was, in many ways, a master of all of them, or did very distinct work in all of them. But anyway, the nature of gold as a substance now. And let's go back to more comprehensive view of Poe as a traveler, a fellow traveler of psyche. As a fellow traveler of psyche, how would we put it, and as a persona, offered to us freely, I've got to do something that I've never been able to do before because the time has never been right. But I've got to I want to see if he's got anything to say, Poe. Will you help me? Will you tell the people to be generous with me in my cogitations? Will you please? Yes, I will. Oh, Edgar, I'm glad that you've come. I don't want to spend a lot of time here in this way. I want to say to you all, be nice to Walker. Be generous with his cogitations and add to them and give them something of your own. Because the generosity of one is the generosity of all, as I said in my book, Eureka, in so many ways. Remember that the particularization is actually an agent by which the individual soul can know itself as all. I have said as much in my book, Eureka, and I want to say later on it was so sensational, my sufferings of my final days. I spent a lot of time in a great state of, I would go and I would declaim passages from my book, Eureka, in the bars. And I would find myself out on the street and I would declaim passages there too, and I would go from place to place. But now listen, understand that though I am these things, I am also not these things. Remember ruthless Griswold. He was the executor of my literary estate, and I had many enemies, and I deserved a great many, yes, but they said things about me that weren't quite true, that kind of gave me kind of an exaggerated kind of sense of my dereliction. But at the same time, I knew the highs and the lows of it all. I did it for the sake of what I could say to the people, of myself to them, no matter the extremity of my circumstances. And besides, isn't it memorable? Yes, it is. And I did not always say things that were so arabesque or grotesque. Sometimes they were quite simple. Later on, for example, when I was contemplating the land of gold, when I was contemplating California, oh, when I was contemplating the great rush to that land, the land that Walker is standing in right now, the land that many of you are also inhabiting, the myth that we are all so fed by no matter what. Oh, I too had something to say about that, though my California is not your California. And your California is not my California. And more specifically, your El Dorado is not my El Dorado. And my El Dorado is not even my El Dorado. But I went there anyway. This is my poem called El Dorado. I wrote this because it's not quite the same as all the other things that you can say about the other poems. Anyway, this is El Dorado. Gaily bedight, a gallant knight in sunlight and in shadow, journeyed long, singing a song in search of El Dorado. But he grew old, this knight so bold, and o'er his heart a shadow fell, for he found no spot of ground that looked like El Dorado. As his strength failed him at length, he met a pilgrim shadow. Shadow, said he, where can it be, this land of El Dorado? O'er the mountains of the moon, and down the valley of the shadow. Ride, boldly ride, the shade replied, if you seek for El Dorado. Oh, Edgar, I was glad when I wrote that, and I'm glad to tell it to you now. Anyway, I must rest. So, back to Walker. If it's silly, forgive me. But I think it really was Edgar, because after all, who are we but masks? Oh yes, that's what I wanted to say. Another thing about that. In the psyche, there is the will of God. Oh, in Eureka, Edgar talks about God and evokes God through the magic of the cognitive truth of poetry. In the psyche, there is the will of God. The will of God we experience is the will to create ourselves. The will to create ourselves. And it is very much the actor who personifies the will to create oneself. The will to create a persona. Actor means persona. To create a mask of oneself through which a designed form of reality can come forth from the unknown. you see. So when I say the will of God, when I'm speaking of it in the language, of the poet now, and that's the way one can speak freely about religious matters, even though Walt Whitman cautions us, argue not concerning God. Well, no, it's not arguing concerning God. It is taking permission from the freedom granted by dwelling in a poetic state of mind to be able to address, questions like the ultimate being. And so when we speak of the will of God, then I submit to you that it felt in the human psyche as the element, the place, the chamber in the house of many mansions, as the will to create oneself. So we create ourselves. But when we create ourselves in this way that Edgar Allan Poe exemplifies, again and again and again, sometimes in dramatic and striking form, like flashes of lightning, so it's going to take form sometimes as kind of extreme, kind of like designed kind of ways to reach out and get the attention of the reader, or whatever kind of recipient or whatever kind of connection one is trying to seek in order to contribute, psychically to the well-being through time of the human spirit, you see. And so there's that. But then at the same time, there's more to Edgar than that, and there's more to Psyche than that, more than the alabaster statue. Psyche was a living being. She was moving among these immobile, divine, kind of classical divinities, but she herself was moving and changing and being in her very thought about what it is that she was doing. And so in the same sense, in the psyche, there's the realm not of self-creating, not where you create yourself, but where you understand. And that's a different kind of like a movement, a different kind of expressive movement. The observer, you might say, Audubon. The bird provided for Audubon, the bird artist. The bird provided the form to be contemplated by Audubon, but it was Audubon's eye that brought the dead bird to life, transmuted into the form of a picture or an image. Okay, but that's the creation. That's the creation out of nothing. But the nothing from which that creation comes, that's where the spirit of understanding abides, which can conceive but not depict for potboiler reasons, but can conceive of an image of the heart as a moving and beating thing which takes in and gives out and takes in and gives out, which even in the form of like the contemplation of language and of understanding the language, that can realize that language is taken apart and put together and taken apart and put together with each expressive utterance, and to recognize the mystery of that without committing to making oneself in the image of any one particular moment of that. That is the spirit of understanding, which can do what the spirit of creation cannot do. The spirit of creation can only render something and make it still. But so nothing is ever like completed, and that's what we have to look at even within the conception and the architecture of Edgar Allan Poe's work, which reaches beyond, which reaches beyond the greatness of itself in the way that I'm trying to understand it now, however playfully. So I want to continue to share some of the poems, but I want to consider what time it is. Okay, I'm cool. I can do this one thing, actually. I would like to do this. I could bring Edgar back to say this, but I think I don't want to like become boorish about it. But but I want to say there was in Edgar Allan Poe's correspondence, he received some kind of like letter asking him, and he gave of himself as an educator. He was asked by a pastor in New York, I think, I don't remember, but to provide an exercise for an elocution lesson. And so Edgar, sometime after Virginia had passed away, he composed a poem. And now, interestingly enough, and this is a whole world in and of itself, those who love Edgar Allan Poe have their own favorite single work of Edgar Allan Poe, and especially with a poem that I'm going to mention now, Ulalume, Some call it his finest work, and others say it's not. It's just incomprehensible. But I would like to tell you that it was Ulalume by Edgar Allan Poe was composed after Virginia had passed away, in response to a letter written by a pastor asking him for something that the pastor could use as a lesson in elocution. And so we get to see some of the most characteristic aspects of Poe's style when we consider it in that way. But also, I must tell you, it was rejected for that. It was not used. I don't know why. The pastor, maybe it was too, I don't know, it was too individual. I have no idea. One wants to have a variety of materials to draw from, for in the arts of education. And so, at any rate, though, he worked on this poem, and Edgar Allan Poe himself said the last stanza doesn't make no sense to me. He didn't say it that way, but others say, oh no, it's all a really great poem, Ulalume. But what I want to mention about it now, there's Psyche is in here, and we will find out a little bit more about Psyche as she journeys through our talk and as she journeys through this poem. And the grieving narrator is here, of course, and he goes on a journey. He doesn't realize it, but his journey takes him to the sepulcher of his dearly departed beloved, who died a year ago to the night of the poem, but he did not even realize that, and yet the poem and the voice led him to the very doorway, and it's shocking and striking and full of that kind of like irony and coincidence and fatedness and weirdness and morbidity and all of that. But another thing I want to mention, auber and where. You will hear words like that. You'll hear a lot of archaicisms. Auber and where. One was a landscape painter and one was a composer. And so when he's talking about them, he's talking about the aesthetic effect, of their works as a landscape in this poem. And anyway, you're going to hear about Psyche. You're going to hear about Diane, the goddess of the moon, Artemis, the crescent moon, the goddess of the silver moon, the goddess of the silver bow, Artemis, also Diana, and he will call. So you'll hear that in the poem, and that this will kind of orient you to that. But then you'll also hear about the constellation Leo. But also you will notice there's another crescent in this poem, and that is Venus. That's the planet Venus. He refers to her as Astarte. It's the reality of Venus, Aphrodite, Psyche's nemesis. Astarte is referred to by her Sumerian name. But also, star lore, uncanny. I think behind the mask, I think I mentioned that. But somewhere in there, it's just, the mystery of Poe's genius kind of comes forth. It's there and it's not there. Turns out he's such a precise stargazer that the image that you'll see of the other crescent is actually Venus. You'll see the crescent moon, Diane's realm, and then you'll see Venus, Astarte. But it is a known fact astronomically as well as astrologically that Venus in retrograde at a certain time will appear through the naked eye, the physical eye, in the sky in the form of a crescent. So when you will see references, to two crescents in the sky, one is of the moon and the other is of Astarte, of Venus, of Aphrodite. But who is with the narrator when he's walking on earth? It is Psyche. So I hope that's a good enough preliminary kind of thing about this poem. Anyway, it's called Ulalume, a ballad. The skies, they were ashen and sober. The leaves, they were crisped and sere. The leaves, they were withering and sere. It was night in the lonesome October of my most immemorial year. It was hard by the dim lake of Auber, in the misty mid-region of Weir. It was down by the dank tarn of Auber, in the ghoul-haunted woodland of Weir. Here once, through an alley titanic of cypress, I roamed with my soul. Of cypress with Psyche, my soul. There were days when my heart was volcanic. and the scoriac rivers that roll as the lavas that restlessly roll their sulphurous currents down Yaanek, and the ultimate climbs of the pole that groan as they roll down Mount Yaanek in the realms of the boreal pole. Our talk had been serious and sober, but our thoughts, they were palsied and sere. Our memories were treacherous and sere, for we knew not the month was October, and we marked not the night of the year. Ah, night of all nights of the year. We noted not the dim lake of Auber, though once we had journeyed down here. We remembered not the dark tarn of Auber, nor the ghoul-haunted woodland of Weir. And now, as the night was senescent, and the star dials pointed to morn, at the end of our path a liquescent and nebulous luster was born, out of which a miraculous crescent arose with a duplicate horn, Astarte's bediamonded crescent, distinct, Astarte's bediamonded crescent, distinct with its duplicate horn. And I said, she is warmer than Diane. She rolls through an ether of sighs. She revels in a region of sighs. She has seen that the tears are not dry on these cheeks where the worm never dies, and has come past the stars of the lion to point us the path to the skies, to the Lethian peace of the skies. Come up, in despite of the lion, to shine on us with her bright eyes. Come up through the lair of the lion with love in her luminous eyes. But Psyche, uplifting her finger, said, sadly, this star I mistrust. Her pallor I strangely mistrust. Ah, hasten! Ah, let us not linger. Ah, fly, let us fly, for we must. In terror she spoke, letting sink her wings till they trailed in the dust. In agony sobbed, letting sink her plumes till they trailed in the dust, till they sorrowfully trailed in the dust. I replied, this is nothing but dreaming. Let us on by the tremulous light. Let us bathe in the crystalline light. Its sibyllic splendor is beaming with hope and in beauty tonight. See, it flickers up the sky through the night. Ah, we may safely trust in its gleaming, and be sure it will lead us aright. We may safely trust to its gleaming that cannot but guide us aright, since it flickers up to heaven through the night. Thus I pacified Psyche, and kissed her, and tempted her out of her gloom, and conquered her scruples and gloom, and we passed to the end of the vista, but were stopped by the door of a tomb, by the door of a legended tomb. And I said, what is written, sweet sister, on the door of this legended tomb? She replied, Ulalume, 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 'tis the vault of thy lost Ulalume. Then my heart it grew ashen and sober, as the leaves that were crisped and sere, as the leaves that were withering and sere. And I cried, it was surely October, on this very night of last year, that I journeyed down here, that I brought a dread burden down here, on this night of all nights in the year. Ah, what demon hath tempted me here? Well, I know now, this dim lake of Auber, this misty mid-region of Weir. Well, I know now this dank tarn of Auber, this ghoul-haunted woodland of Weir. Said we then, the two then, ah, can it have been that the woodlandish ghouls, the pitiful, the merciful ghouls, to bar up our way and to ban it from the secret that lies in these wolds, from the thing that lies hidden in these wolds, have drawn up the specter of a planet from the limbo of lunary souls, this sinfully scintillant planet from the hell of planetary souls? And it was that last stanza that Edgar Allan Poe said, I don't understand it either. But actually, the planetary souls, the lunary souls, actually, again, I think, we can just kind of play with this a little bit. It lays it out. There's the psyche, and of course the psyche is the one who warned. The psyche said, well, she did. I'm saying that she said this. That's Venus in retrograde. That's misfortune. Let us continue with the moon, and let us continue through this journey together, you and I, oh voice. Kind of like. But the narrator says, no, the moon is cold, but this is blazing, this bediamonded phenomena, and I want to follow that. And so Venus in retrograde leads him to the door of the tomb, you see. So there's that then. Now, it's so many things, of course, and I don't know if I read it with it was designed to be an elocution lesson in 19th century American speech. And I wonder, I wonder how it really sounds. I can only just touch on it. Now, I want to read one more poem at least, and then I'll just wind it up, of course. But now, I am under the impression that this poem was written when Edgar Allan Poe was in the army still. Now, and it's also true that, and I don't know all the details, but like Yeats, Poe continued to revise his poems again and again and revisit them. And there's all kinds of editorial controversy. He mentioned Griswold, Rufus Griswold. There's lots of literary feuds, Rufus Griswold became his executor and evidently had some personal axes to grind. And so Poe's reputation has kind of been sensationalized in a lot of different ways. As a matter of fact, I'm sure that there are many of the things that I referred to this evening are probably controversial to some of the aficionados of Poe. I'm not sure either that he was worse than that or not as bad as that, but whatever, it's the mix, the lights and the shadows in the night, in sunlight and in shadow. But anyway, so there's the morbidity, there's the classical stillness, there's the arrested motion, there's the intricacies, and then there's the star lore. Well, here's a little bit different of star lore. And that isn't, but I want to, here's a quote I wanted to say. I mentioned the freedom granted by poetry, by the realms of poetic speech, to allow one to speak of God without the heavy millstones of literalism and stuff. Well, here's Poe on that. He sounds a little more cynical, and that's fine, whatever cynical means. Cynical means bark. Cynical is named after the bark of a dog, as I understand it. What was it? Diogenes used to bark at people, and so that's why we have the term cynical. It means so much less and more as the years roll on. But anyway, that's the way I've described it, and now I regret having described it that way. Here's the quote from Poe: "All religion, my friend, is simply evolved out of fraud, fear, greed, imagination, and poetry. All religion, my friend, is simply evolved out of fraud, fear, greed, imagination, and poetry." So that, and Poe made it possible to say that also art is evolved out of that also. The troubled psyche and also the fraud and all, etc., but also imagination and poetry. So anyway, so there's an angel. There's an angel. I want to mention quickly Rilke's angel in the Duino elegies. Rilke's conception of the angel, who would hear me if I called out to the angels, in their hierarchy. It was in the Quran. The nature of that book is such that the notion of the angel comes forth free of some of the incrustations of the angel in other traditions. For some reason, artists again and again have found inspiration from the pages of the Quran in the depiction of certain angels, and I think that's the way that the stories are told also, in terms of like I wonder that if the lamplight, the psyche lamplight in the reading mind, the religions of the word, you see, they're called that for a reason. The religions of the word are called that for a reason. In the beginning was the word. I don't know. But anyway, so here's a quote from Poe. Here's Poe's note about this poem. It is called Israfel. "And the angel Israfel, whose heartstrings are a lute, and who has the sweetest voice of all God's creatures." That's Poe saying, quoting the Quran. That's Poe's note. So the angel The heartstrings are a lute. The angel's musical instrument is the angel, you see. The form of art and the art are one. You know, the voice and the song it sings and the nature of the song are one. So there's Poe again and again. There's the dream of unity and the reality of unity glimpsed in these ununified ways. Anyway, this is Israfel, the angel, a poem about the angel, his heartstrings are a lute. And yes, it goes like this. In heaven a spirit doth dwell, whose heartstrings are a lute. None sing so wildly well as the angel Israfel. And the giddy stars, so legends tell, ceasing their hymns, attend the spell of his voice all mute. Tottering above, in her highest noon, the enamored moon blushes with love, while to listen, the red levin with the rapid Pleiads even, which were 7, pauses in heaven. And they say, the starry choir and the other listening things, that Israfel's fire is owing to that lyre by which he sits and sings, the trembling living wire of those unusual strings. But the skies that angel trod, where deep thoughts are a duty, where love's a grown-up God, and the hoary glances are imbued with all the beauty which we worship in a star. Therefore thou art not wrong, Israfel, who despisest an unimpassioned song. To thee the laurels belong, best bard, because the wisest merrily live and long. The ecstasies above, which thy burning measures suit, thy grief, thy joy, thy hate, thy love, with the fervor of thy lute. Well may the stars be mute. Yes, heaven is thine, but this is a world of sweets and sours. Our flowers are merely flowers, and the shadow of thy perfect bliss is the sunshine of ours. If I could dwell where Israfel hath dwelt, and he where I, he might not sing so wildly well a mortal melody, while a bolder note than this might swell from my lyre within the sky. So Israfel is his own music. That angel is his own music. Angel means messenger. So there's a certain kind of poetry of messages in that, I'm sure. Anyway, so to that, to that angelic voice, which is also, the angel demon, as in Hermann Hesse's esoteric novel, Demian, Abraxas. Why am I saying that? I don't know if Poe ever mentions Abraxas, but he's steeped in that kind of like popular esoteric lore that will reappear and appear again in the works of esoteric romantic poets, like Hermann Hesse, like Edgar Allan Poe, and all these others. I want to mention really quickly about Whitman. Here's what Whitman had to say about Poe. And I'm not going to read it to you. I'll just paraphrase it. Whitman had the simile. Whitman said something to the effect of, "I had a dream once of a tempest at sea, and there was a schooner there, a small sailboat, and the way of the schooner upon the waves, and the voyager on that ship." Exemplifies Poe to me, says Whitman, because of the daring nature and the danger of this figure on these kind of seas, and the obscureness of the navigation. And this, in a sense, is Poe to me. D.H. Lawrence spoke of Poe as a scientist. An artist is involved in creation and destruction, said D.H. Lawrence, whereas Poe, into D.H. Lawrence's eye, in studies in classical American literature, is a scientist dissecting something. And I've mentioned some degree of that, but let's look beyond that at Poe the Sage, ultimately. Eureka means I have found it. And Poe the Sage has something to say to us about our journey toward the one with Psyche, hearing her voice or not, but accompanied by Psyche. And that's, to me, is the poetic voice of Edgar Allan Poe. And may it be amongst us. So that's my message then. I thank you for your heroic listening, and so long for now.